Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Show Up with Cameron Gran. I am your host, Cameron Gran, and just as a little reminder, I'm not a therapist. I'm just somebody going on his own mental health journey, trying to give you little tips and tricks that I've used for myself. Please try them or don't. It's up to you. All I will say is try to keep an open mind because you never know something that you might hear that might help you. Because really, that's all that you're looking for is advocating for yourself. Is kind of also having enough of an open mind to find the things that really work for you. For me, something that I'm advocating for with this episode is a check-in, because I'm trying to do those at least once a month, and I know some of you are like, isn't every episode a check-in? A little bit, but that's, okay. It's my little method for myself. But the reason why I'm doing it is because I've noticed that my emotions have been, like, at the drop of a hat. I don't know why it's been that way. Sometimes, here's the thing with me is if emotions are happening out of nowhere, that's when I'm like, okay, I need to spend more time trying to be present because nothing that's happening should make you as emotional that you're becoming. And I know what you're thinking, isn't that a self-judgment? It is if I was upset with myself for like being overly emotional. I'm not. That's kind of why people are a lot of times like, oh, you should look at this journey as kind of a science experiment. Instead of judging the facts that are happening, just write them down and then notice the things that are repeating and the things that aren't everyday occurrences, because then you can know, oh, what is my baseline? And then what are things that are outside of it pushing me above or below the line? And that's more of what is concerning me is like, oh, well, nothing extreme is happening and nothing minor is happening, but still my emotions are like could strike at any moment. And it's not necessarily a problem, but it got me curious. And that's more of what I wanted to look into is like, oh, that thing is sad, but like, it's not as sad as I'm making it. It's like if somebody started like crying at a happy moment, and this is, for example, if you ever watched The Theory of Everything, which is the story of Stephen Hawking and how he like changes from being really mobile to being in his chair. And a lot of people are like, yeah, that movie's really sad. And so they started crying like when the sad stuff is happening. And me, I started crying when like the happiest stuff was happening. Like the moments where like he had a real connection with his wife and they were super, super happy. And my friend was like, it's really weird that you're really crying a lot when they're happy. And that's something I was like, oh, is that a problem? Again, that's just a movie, but it's an example of like an emotional response that doesn't really match the situation. And that's been happening to me a lot. Well, and I don't want to say that's a negative thing because part of it is like, if you watch a lot of television, and I've been watching a lot of like shows for this Thanksgiving break, for instance, I'd never seen it before, and I kind of just binged all of Bridgerton. It was a lot better than I thought, and a lot of the stuff that I thought were my reasons not to see it weren't as prevalent as I was led to believe. And then I was like, oh wait, why was I so worried to watch this show when I know it's by it's Shonda Land, so it's Shonda. Gosh, I'm pretty sure it's Shonda Rhimes, the writer of Grey's Anatomy, and I've always loved her as a writer, but like. Again, moving to Netflix I don't hate Netflix, but I don't like the writing style on Netflix because they don't write from momentum, and part of the issue used to be the fact that they don't have commercials. Now, if you want a Netflix account, you can get like an ad plan, which is a lot cheaper. And so my hope for Netflix eventually, maybe I'll actually keep my Netflix account because I really only ever buy it for like a month and then I just quit because I'm like, I only wanted to watch the show that I like, and then after that show comes out and I've seen it, no longer need you in my life because I don't like the writing style, and it is because it lacks momentum. Like if you watch most of like the CW or shows like from like early 2000s, a lot of them build to the commercial break so that you'll keep watching during the next part of the show because they want you to look past the amount of commercials you have to watch the show. And so for that reason, I feel like it makes you feel like there are a lot more at stake in a show. And that's something that Netflix lacked, I think, when they didn't have commercials and the writers weren't aware of that. So maybe I'll come back to it in the future, but like that has to do with a point that I had something else, but I guess I forgot that point. So I guess I wanted to complain about Netflix. Because I was watching Bridgerton and I was like, oh, okay, this actually is way better. The only problem I have with Bridgerton is the major premise of that show is it's kind of like we changed one thing in history and this is like them dealing with that thing. But I still have an issue with I have an issue with the fact that like women can't do a lot of the things that they're openly showing the guys doing on screen, and that kind of bothers me because it feels like a double-edged, like, oh, okay, so we expect more from this gender and not as much from this other gender, and so when like they get ruined for things. It's something that, as somebody who is an actor and loves acting, I was amazed to find that if you decide to become an opera singer, that somehow puts you as less than in polite society. That blew my mind because I'm like, I love opera singers. I think they're amazing. But actors, I guess nobody wants you to be with an actor because even though they love to see you perform, you're not in the polite highs of society of the ton or whatever. But it's just, I guess I wanted to talk about Bridgerton. There are a lot of things in that show that just surprised me. With like how dramatic it is, and again, I don't know how you can be surprised if you've ever watched Shonda Rhimes and anything. Grey's Anatomy goes to so many places nobody else would ever go, so I don't know why the writing surprises me. Like Queen Charlotte, if you ever decide to sit down and watch Queen Charlotte, let me tell you, that show will ruin you, because now I have to do research because I'm like, oh, I thought they had made up this thing because the basis of Queen Charlotte is kind of like them playing around with the idea of Queen Charlotte's a main character from the Bridgerton, but also the fact that her husband is George and he supposedly is the Mad King George. And I wanted to talk about this because, spoiler, but the show's been out for a while. He's called Mad King George, which is a real thing that is in history. But then the thing that they were playing at reminded me so much of like schizophrenia, and I was like, oh wow, if you had that at that time, it would kind of be the scary thing for other people, especially if you're supposed to be the person ruling your country. And just finding like reason why I say you should watch at least Queen Charlotte is the fact that so much is said to like love somebody despite like their faults. And the fact that like this king is only half there because he also has like these voices going on in his head and this like constant need to like do with like the moon and I guess star charting and then science. But again, it reminds me of schizophrenia because the way that they depict like the voices happening in his head and then the way that he has to become centered is because something that they've talked about with people is like, oh, if you're not sure if what's happening around you is real, make sure that somebody's in the room and you can ask them if this thing is actually happening. And the reason why they tell you to do that is because then you have more of an anchor point, if that works. Whereas if you're by yourself, it's harder to like check the facts. But if you're with somebody, with like George has Charlotte, and that's kind of the journey they go on, is how he opens up to Charlotte and lets her see that part of himself. And then once he does, they have this like really beautiful marriage. See, I'm getting emotional just talking about this because it's kind of like, I feel like a lot of people who suffer from mental like stuff are afraid of putting themselves out there and being rejected by people that they love. And that show is kind of like, oh, well, you may not understand something and it might be separate from what would be part of what's considered normal of society. But if you take everything and give it its grace and just allow it to have this moment and stop jumping to huge conclusions, because one of the triggers that he has is when he doesn't confide in people and he's just putting all this pressure on himself, and that's kind of what triggers what's going on with him. And that happens with me in my anticipation anxiety is normally if I'm not putting pressure on myself, I am more free to do things. But the more pressure I put on, the more it becomes an incapability. And it's harder to be by yourself and not know how to stop you from pressure. Like, we all have these luggage bags, and you're only supposed to have a 50-pound limit if you go on a plane, but we all like to overstuff our luggage bags. So we're barely dragging them, and the wheels are about to like snap out from underneath you because you're forcing yourself to take on more than you can. And that was something that I liked about that. It shows different triggers, and it showed kind of like how bad science was at that time and how they would deal with those things, but like, and also just how it was hard for you to be as open as you are today when it comes to like triggers and stuff. And I didn't realize that I would have that such a huge reaction to the show. But it just got me because it's like, you don't realize how important it is to let somebody see you completely until you are really struggling, and then that person who knows you can ground you, because they're the only one that you can trust to be like, no, that's not part of reality, but I'll play with you until you get back to me, and I can share with you all the things that are actually happening around you. Ooh, I have to stop talking about it because the more I think about it, the more emotional I'm getting. But again, this is just me talking about the show. I'm not even like watching it anymore. And it's like, why are all these emotions so close to the surface? An argument could be made that like November just ended, and that is when my mother passed away from her overdose. And the thing that I always wanted to have with my family is just this open conversation, because the more that we try to hide from things, the more I feel things fester in our brains and they become uncontrollable. They become these narratives. And also, a lot of society is like, what does people think of me? And that's also something that I'm trying to let go of, because I realize that it's not my business. Your perception is not me. And if I keep trying to put myself in your shoes, then I'm never going to want to take action because it feels like too much. Like what helped George because he was really struggling to do things like go to Parliament and give speeches, and it was because he was looking at hundreds of people all at once. Whereas when they started pushing, like, no, channel those emotions into one place and just focus on what you're channeling. Because if you try to take in every single person, like, you can look at them and you can see them, but if you're trying to like take in everybody's burden, you're not going to be able to hold that like focus and make sure that you're like protecting yourself in a way, because the world is not as happy of a place as I would like to believe, and that makes me upset. But I know that if I stay focused with what my mission is and what I'm trying to push with these videos, which is really just the fact that we should listen to each other more, period. Like, just because somebody doesn't have similar ideals to you does not mean that they are, I think, evil. And I think right now everyone's pushing the fact that if I don't talk like you, if you don't understand me, then the only choice I have is to kind of, it feels like the answer that's being pushed is to eradicate somebody or to like limit them, rather than, hey, how do you experience life? How do you what makes you happy? What is your spiritual journey? Like, how, when you see these things, do you deal and cope with it? And to me, that's pushing more along the lines of, I think of it as like scientific curiosity, where you're trying to understand other people, but you're not. Again, the core values is a huge thing. It's like, once you know what you value most, you can be like, you can be concrete in them. And so when you ask somebody, you can be genuine with like wanting to learn from them, because a lot of people think that other people are trying to push something on them, and they're not. It's them just trying to share that they're also present and in this world. And we're kind of in a place where I think we're more alone because of social media, because of the fact that everyone's like, well, I could just like see people on TikTok and like do this stuff. So I think we're going out less, And so we're forgetting that people are real and that they have emotions and that we should all care about those emotions. And I don't want I just don't want to be in a space where that's an okay thing, because I don't understand everybody. And I also am somebody who I'm working on the fact that my face comes off as very judgmental. I've been told that a lot. And usually what that means is my thoughts are being challenged, and so I'm more focused on my thoughts are thinking than the other person, and so I am sometimes not aware of what my face does when I'm thinking really hard, and that's why people think I'm judging them. And I am somebody who people are surprised when I'm like, I don't actually have a huge opinion about what you're doing. I have things that I would never do and I don't want to do, but like I can respect you and you being your own free person to make other decisions for me. And as long as those things are making you happy and aren't like hurting other people, then I think that that's fine, because that just means that you're showing me another way of existing in this world and being happy and doing what you need, and that's fine. And also I think that's beautiful, because sometimes we get limited when we find ourselves in echo chambers, and like the place I feel the safest being has always been in an audition line. Ironically, we're now doing self-tapes, so they're isolating us even more. So now it's very less likely to see another actor unless you're doing like a callback. And even then, if they're seeing you in person, that's when you have real competition trying to get to you, because you're like, oh, well, if we're all being called back, that means that we really have a shot for these roles. And I do love acting, and it's something that I want to do more this next year. But I want to tell the story. I don't like look at how do I say this? I love other actors because we're all about exploring the way the world works and how other people can view things and experience those things in life. And a lot of times you see things that you yourself are never going to experience, mostly because you don't have those same things. But the point is not to make you aware of like what you do have and what you don't have. It's more about like, hey, I did not realize that this is this bad for somebody else, and maybe when see somebody in the future that's similar to this, I will have more of an open mind and try to hear them rather than freak out because of my own notions that I've had, because I'm in this echo chamber that echoes those things. And I feel like the biggest thing that I've learned is, oh, just because I had this perception of something, like I had a huge perception of what Bridgerton was, and then I started watching it and I was like, oh, okay, this is very much more along the lines of a show that I would want to watch. Because something that also is happening with Netflix is I find the way that they depict certain things to be overly grotesque, and that's what I thought Bridgerton was. And then I was like, oh no, it's very romanticized, mostly, sometimes not, but and that bothers me, because I fall in love with stories, and I don't like seeing things that are just there for like, I call it fitter fodder. It's not there for a purpose. It's just because like, oh well, we need this because we promised people this stuff in this show, so we gotta make sure we deliver, but this has no bearing on the plot. And they don't do that in the show, but that's what I thought happened, because that's why I have to be careful with HBO, because sometimes I really like HBO shows, and then sometimes I'm like, oh, okay, I don't want to watch this. It's not, and I don't think it's a negative, because I know people that are out there that do enjoy that and can see it for what it is, but it's just not something that I enjoy, because I like the story aspect. It means more in the story to me, but I can still see how other people have that perception, if that makes sense. But what I just said, if you played it back, could have sounded like a judgment, and if that's what it came across as, that wasn't my intention, because it's just me being like, wow, there are people that really like this kind of thing. It's why I had a problem watching Game of Thrones, is because Game of Thrones eventually dives more into like a social commentary type of show, and I've seen clips of later on seasons, and I was like, oh, okay, well, if they had started doing this and it was clear from the beginning that's what the show was, I might have watched it. But now I don't want to even approach it because it feels like super fandom. And I've learned from like I can dabble in a show, but I can't be part of a super fandom because then I feel like there's too much pressure to like something. And Game of Thrones is one of those shows that does that for me. Like if my dad was not a super fan of Star Wars, I wouldn't have watched Star Wars because of how like serious people that I know are about those movies. Because I'm a fan of certain things, but I don't like have a super like love for them. And if people don't know everything, which is just people that I've met that are like this, because I've met people who have watched Star Wars that are just like, yeah, it's fun. But I also met super fans, and I'm like, I cannot keep up with you. I enjoy the stuff I've watched, but I'm not somebody that could have an in-depth conversation about Star Wars because I did not memorize those things. Because I was more entertained by like the story parts and not as much about like the world building of Star Wars, if that makes sense. Like it's something that I've learned with literature that I love is I love details if they matter towards the story. I hate details if they're just there to fill in space. Fitter fodder. Like J.R.R. Tolkien, I love him to death. The Hobbit he wrote with the intention of it being a children's book. And for that reason, he got rid of all the extra details that weren't necessary. So it's more readable to me because everything that's mentioned has to do with what's happening in the story. Whereas The Hobbit, it opens with like a complete dictation of what habits the hobbits love, which it wouldn't be bad to me if it was like we were being shown what they love through scenes. No, it's like a speech, a monologue. Anybody could give that monologue about being like, these are the characteristics of hobbits, and like the second breakfasts and like the very elaborate dinners, and like it's very, very like a speech about what hobbits love. And then we dive into Bilbo Baggins eventually and about like how everyone's looking forward to his birthday. I bet you guys didn't know that we were gonna talk about Lord of the Rings, but that's something that, like, that's why it's been hard for me to read The Lord of the Rings, because you can also get to the part where he just describes a tree branch for 3 pages. And I'm like, bruh, this tree branch had better be important, because I did not spend 3 pages reading about it for it just to be a tree branch. And then, little did you know, it was just a tree branch. And then you're like, okay, well, lesson learned. Next time I feel like a detail is just going on for too long, I'll just look for when the story starts again. But that could also be the fact that I am not a huge fan of world omnipotence writing. It's when like I don't like when the narrator just chooses to like, oh, we're gonna follow this for a little bit, and then we're gonna follow this for a little bit, and then I'm gonna comment about it for a second, and then we're gonna follow this for a little bit. It's like I don't like that kind of third person omnipotent type of storytelling. Narnia, C.S. Lewis does it a little bit, and he does it more than in other stories than he does in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. And I'm like, hey, I know I'm reading, but you don't have to remind me that I'm reading. You don't have to remind me that these are kids. And so that's why they're calling this thing this damn thing, and like not you or I would know it to be. It's just something that fascinates me when it comes to like details, is because I've written a manuscript, and my goal for this coming year is just to get it to a publisher and then hopefully have it on the books to get published. But I know that's going to take some time. But the major thing that I wanted to remind myself of is just to have less pressure, because pressure is a huge thing for me. Is because I've written in, and if I apply a huge amount of pressure, it's hard for me to work on it. And I just need to stop putting pressure on it. Just like open it, have it ready, and then just go. Because the more I do it, the like more pages get down, and the more closer I will be to accomplishing that goal. Same thing with auditions. Everyone's like, oh, once you learn the lines, that's it. But like, I really think that you should, which is one of my goal for 2024. I'm going to audition for a lot of stuff. I'm not planning to get any of that stuff, mostly because I want to work towards just the art of auditioning, because that makes me nervous. Something that my school taught me was that you should always know who you're going into a room for. But also, I mess up when I go into an audition because then I feel like the pressure is there, and then I'm like, oh, I'm not good enough. But like people who get their work are usually like, I'm just going to focus in, do what I decided, and then they can take it or leave it after I've just showed them what I want to bring to the character, if that makes sense. Because something that you have to be as an actor is adaptive. Like you can't be 100% on what you're doing, but like they have to know that you have a baseline. And if you have a baseline, then they can mold it one way or the other if they see something in you. But if they don't know whether or not they like your take or whether or not you have a strong take to give, it's harder for them to work with you, which is why I want to work on this skill, because I feel like the nerves of audition is more of what my issue has been. But also just jumping in, like stop overthinking, just do it, you know, what like Nike says, like the more you jump in, the more you're free to, I guess, really work on certain things. I think that I'm going to make this another short episode, not because I don't want to talk to you guys, because I love these check-ins and hearing from you and trying to share things with DBT, but also because I have had a lot of stress this past week because I'm trying to do my schoolwork and yet again I'm having issues, and I really wanted to focus on this episode because this is one thing that I have control over, and that's also something that I wanted to highlight is sometimes life isn't going the way we want it to, but we have to recognize the things we can control and the things that we can't control. And I can control doing this episode and making sure it comes out. I can't control the fact that last week was a holiday week and I haven't got responses from people, so I can't do my schoolwork because until I get those responses, I can't access something. You know what I'm saying? Is like those are things that require third parties, but if I can do the things that I know are actually within my grasp, I think that it's very beneficial. And so that's kind of what I wanted to highlight. And hopefully you guys will learn from my example, especially because like we're going into December, and December is all about like, I think, expectations, so many, because it's the holidays and like people want like the best possible Christmases or like Hanukkahs, whatever holiday you celebrate possible, because they really want to show their children how much they care, or their family how much they care for them. And a lot of times we get lost in, I think, the stress of it all, rather than reminding ourselves that, hey, yes, it's cool to receive presents, and yes, it's cool to look at a pretty tree with a pretty lights on it, but like that's not what we're there for. We're there for the family time. We're there to really enjoy and love the people that we're here with, because time isn't guaranteed, and just because you expect something to happen doesn't mean that it will. And that's something that I'm learning to process and get better at, is, you know, not hating those moments, but just being like, okay, well, that happened. I can't control that person. They can be a jerk, and I can do what I can to focus on safety and when I'm in safety, then I will figure out what I could have done differently or how I could prepare myself in case this thing should arise again. And that's something that I think is also important, is just reminding ourselves that in those moments we feel unsafe, the biggest thing you can focus on is just, okay, we need to focus on where safety is. Until we're in our safety zone, we're not going to address this. We're going to move on, because freeze, I'm the king of it. I've learned it. I've adapted to it. But it's not really a response that's going to get you somewhere where you can work on something or make sure that you're in a safe place. What will get you in a safe place is knowing where, like, you feel safe. Your home, like a library, like an office, like somewhere that feels safe so you can collect yourself, is important, especially as you go through more stressful times, especially like the holidays. With that, I'm going to bring this episode to a close. I really hope you guys enjoyed this. I really enjoy doing these episodes for you. Please, if you're watching this on YouTube, subscribe, like, comment. I appreciate anything that you can say. I have a happy holiday if I don't hear from you for the rest of the month. And as always, don't forget to stop, take a deep breath in, deep breath out, and remember to show up for yourself, because you matter.